Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Econ Americas podcast, where we share under the radar investment opportunities from countries across our big continent in North America, Central America, and South America. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and find us on all the major podcast platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Anchor, you name it. If this is the first time you're listening to this show, Econ Americas is a startup research firm that provides financial and economic intelligence. I am Daniel Duarte, editor at Econ Americas, and in this episode, we'll be discussing what Honduras has to offer investors. I am joined by Guillermo Peña. He's an old acquaintance of Econ Americas. He's a political analyst and economist based in San Pedro Sula. He's also managing partner of Blackbird Media Group, a brand strategy firm, and the technical secretary for Orquídea ZEDE. He has worked with think tanks in North Carolina, London, and Honduras. Guillermo, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure to be on, Daniel. Thank you for having me.
Sure, Guillermo, and we always start our conversation with a brief overview of the country we are covering. To get our listeners up to speed. So please tell us a bit about Honduras, its economy, the major industries, actors, and the business partners that it has abroad.
Well, Honduras as the only country in Central America that has most of its economy based on the Caribbean side, our major area of influence is the eastern coast and southern United States as one of our main export areas and areas of influence, also through investment. But it's important to put in perspective the country in a longer term, more than just where we are. We've definitely been in a weird year and a half, like the rest of the world has. But if we go back to 2009, which is when we had a large political problem caused instability in the country for a good while, where a president was removed. And since then, months later, we had an election. And since then, we have had 3 elections, and now going on to the 4th election, which happened. They've all been as according to plan on time period as established in the Constitution. And now they're going into this 4th election after that political hiccup, which would end up, I would expect, closing a period of instability. But that instability, like any opportunity, all opportunities that come after big problems, allowed us to participate in a lot of reforms in the country in strategic sectors that were very important for the economy and for the stability of the economy on the investment attraction side. And that has been one of them. One of the main reforms was the creation of the special economic zones known as ZEDEs, Zonas de Empleo y Desarrollo Económico, which have been controversial, but have attracted a lot of international attention for the country. Another big sector that was reformed during that period was the education system, and the third major reform was the energy sector. In the ZEDEs and energy are both areas that I've been working on since the reform happened. And the main sectors, I guess, in the economy would be, we are sadly we would say that the largest influx of capital coming in is from remittances, representing some years up to 20 to 21% of GDP, and that's mostly coming remittances from the U.S. and Spain. That would account for over 90% of the remittances. But besides that situation, the country is an exporter of manufacturing goods and agricultural products as the main industries, and the service sector growing every year more. But we're still we're still on early stages in the financial sector, and expecting infrastructure to be a big part of the economy in the future. We haven't had the strongest growth in the country happened back in 2007 and 2008, and since then we have not been able to reach a 6% over a 6% growth. But during that time, or at least since 2011, 12, we've had international agreements with the IMF regarding monetary stability, inflation control, and opening certain sectors that were considered monopoly sectors, or areas of the economy that were controlled um, by government entities, government companies. So that has been the main reform, and the stability has come through those arrangements with the IMF, which allowed the country to also stabilize and be able to start placing sovereign bonds back in international markets, which hadn't happened at least for 30, 40 years before that happened again in 2011. And since then, we've done 3 or 4 placements of sovereign bonds every time with lower interest rates, which is a good signal for
Sure.
investors.
So our main topic today is ZEDEs, of course, and they have also been called charter cities or startup cities. And I think it's one of the most exciting social experiments around, and it's happening in Honduras of all places. But many have never heard of them. So why don't you briefly explain what ZEDEs are, what is the purpose of them, and why were they necessary in a country like Honduras? And we'll get into the details in a few minutes. So just a foundation for listeners.
Okay. The basis is Honduras, like much of Latin America, have weak institutions and because of that, a weak rule of law. And that's one of the reasons why it's hard to bring institutional investment to the region. That's been a traditional behavior in Latin America. So through that idea, and after the political problem in 2009, that's when the opportunity happened, where even politicians and those in Congress and at presidential palace and from all parties had to reevaluate what they were doing in politics and how that affected their country and what they really wanted. And that's where the idea came from to do these. It's, if we could say there's different ways to reform a country. One is do a straight up national reform, or toppling a government, or a new constitution, which we know that brings for instability for quite a couple of years after. Then another way is to do the piecemeal reform process, which is little by little, and which has been the traditional way of building nations for a long time. And then this third way, which we say is let's do wish list areas in which we can allow for major reform to happen, not only on the fiscal front, but special economic zones with competitive governance structures, which allow for the best rules to come out, and then those be implemented in the rest of the country through example and not through political force, as other national reforms have to be done. So that was the idea. And I would say there's different views on people on the project, but in general, I would say that these fall under the free zone industry, which is there's over 4,000 free zones in the world. There's different categories of free zones. I would say this falls under the special economic zones category, where it's not only fiscal but other regulatory behavior that it's also differentiated from the rest of the country. So that's where I would place ZEDEs in.
Exactly. So what makes ZEDEs unique is that they not only have, tax incentives like many special economic zones have, but they also can enjoy a large degree of autonomy in rulemaking, policymaking, and even, I believe, in lawmaking, if I'm correct. What does the ZEDE framework allow developers in Honduras to achieve?
Well, one is that one of the first things I'd say is that it's a predictable legal framework in which to work under for many decades in the future. The idea is private land to be authorized to create a special jurisdiction. The jurisdictions have an internal autonomy regulation that is controlled by an initial charter, which set the rules for the zone and how to change them. Also, what the aim of the zone is. So one of the big, free zones have failed. There's enough free zones in the world and enough countries with free zones in the world that we know which are the ones that fail the most. And the ones that fail the most are those that the location is decided by government, and that they are, and the second reason is that they're public land backed by public funds, forcing an economic activity in an area that does not have the quality for whatever they're trying to create. And that's usually been the main reason for the failure of free zones around the world. So in this case, it's private land that there's a private owner that, you know, they can partner up with a ZEDE developer or develop it by themselves, and that jurisdiction is still within a municipality, is still within Honduras, but has the regulatory possibility of modifying rules, both the financial sector, health sector, monetary, immigration. But what we have learned in this process, and most of the people that initially came interested in this regulation, like the autonomy part, and when we go into the practice, you have to be, there's a lot of real politics to have to put into this.
Sure.
And there's reality that you have to deal with, public opinion, and also since within, so the framework goes like this: there's the Honduran Constitution, there is all the treaties, international treaties that Honduras has signed, and then the ZEDE law, and then internal normatives. They're not legislation, they're internal normatives for the ZEDE. So we don't call them laws, we don't call them legislation. It's internal normatives that have to be authorized in order to be effective. So that's in that order of categories, basically within what the Constitution allows us, within what the ZEDE law allows us, and within what we have to comply with all international treaties and all of their standards. So besides those limitations, that's what we can modify and reform in order to allow for the different types of development that happen. The other thing is that these zones, they're not directed towards an industry. For example, there's a big difference between our zonas libres or free zones in Honduras and ZEDEs, in that free zones are mainly all for export processes and do not allow for residents. ZEDEs do allow residents and do allow for an internal economy. But regarding penal code, we have everything that's illegal in Honduras is illegal in the zones. Customs, we have to comply with international customs standards, and that goes from hazardous materials to prohibited items. We cannot participate in any illegal activity regarding international customs regulations. So there's been a lot said. There's a lot more details than just that. But so in general, this framework allows for many different industries to work within the ZEDE law, and you apply the parts that you want. You do not need to apply everything, as some people, I think, have also tried, but it's limiting to what you need and eventually scaling up in regulations and normatives.
Right. So that means you don't have to, plan everything beforehand. You can,
I think it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake to plan everything from the start and say that you have all of your book of regulations. That's you're tying yourself to a lot of unknowns, and creating problems where there shouldn't be problems. Because if you're starting a new economic activity area where there's little or none, and you have normatives for complex procedures like producing let's say, intellectual property for the manufacturing of new health sector products. That usually involves ethics issues, involves human trials, involves. So if you set up those normatives from the start, then you're already running into trouble because you allow people's minds to run into all of the problems and not build up when you need it as you need it.
Right.
So it really is what it's I consider it better that it's better to do a bottom up. It's ZEDEs are a bottom up approach, but to really do, instead of a centrally planned, I will plan the whole framework. It's let's go setting up frameworks for only for what we need, and that keeps it. It's a lean management, lean startup idea, but it's you only create what you need. Otherwise, you get distracted and create problems where there shouldn't be.
Costa Rica, one of Latin America's most thriving economies, is betting on foreign capital to boost its economic recovery. It has passed a new piece of legislation called Law to Attract Investors, Retirees, and Pensioners. Before the pandemic, foreign investment and trade liberalization were the cornerstones of Costa Rica's 25 years of steady economic growth. A rarity in Latin America, Costa Rica has enjoyed political stability and healthy institutions reflected in competitive development indicators. Although its economy contracted by 4.6% in 2020, Costa Rica will grow 2.6% in 2021 and 3.3% in 2022, according to the World Bank. Costa Rica ranks among the world's best places to retire. Besides stunning beaches and warm weather year-round, the country is now offering better immigration benefits and extended tax incentives to lure new residents and investors. Retirees with a minimum pension of $1,000 and those who can demonstrate a monthly income higher than $2,500 can move to Costa Rica and enjoy fiscal perks. For investors, the new law reduces the minimum amount from $200,000 to $150,000. Investors can allocate those funds to real estate, registrable assets, stocks, securities, and productive investments. Another change is that now investors will receive a 10-year residence permit, up from the previous 2 years, and can extend it for 5 years. The new law will provide investors and retirees the following benefits: exemption of import duties on household goods, exemption of import duties on up to 2 vehicles for personal use, income tax exemption on earnings qualified under the law, a 20% reduction of the transfer tax on assets acquired in Costa Rica, exemption of import duties for assets used in a professional or scientific capacity. The Costa Rican government will set up a single-stop shop to assist individuals wishing to enter the country under the investor and retiree categories. Those interested can submit their applications until July 2026. If approved, investors and retirees will enjoy the incentives for 10 years. To learn more about investment and entrepreneurship opportunities in Costa Rica, reach out to the country's investment agency promotion or follow our work at ecanamericas.com.
Right. Here at Econ Americas, we have been following this topic for a long time. And initially, I've got to be honest, we were skeptical because for years, nothing seemed to come out of it. There was a controversial constitutional amendment. Many leaders of the initial project abandoned it. But last year, amid the pandemic, we were surprised. I think many were surprised to see the first ZEDE emerge in the island of Roatan, and it's called Prospera Honduras. And we have a backgrounder on that we'll put in the show notes. So how many other ZEDEs have emerged since and what are their selling points? Because, as you said, each ZEDE can specialize if they choose, of course. And I know of 3 so far, but maybe there are more in the works.
No, there's only 3 approved and functioning sedes.
Okay.
So you've mentioned Prospera, which have their own particular. It's more of a city scale project. Then you have Sede Morazan, which is a manufacturing, logistics, health sector oriented sede with residents, which is out here in a town next to San Pedro Sula in Choloma. And then Sede Orquídea, which is the one that I participate in, which is a single entity agro-industrial park for export. So this is really an export project. It's an $85 million investment project. Will be fully built in 4 years, employing around 3,000 people, 2,700 to be, that's expected exactly. The project will begin exporting in January 2022. So we have already, there's a workforce of over 400 people already. We started in November, and all of our normatives are basically around how to export food products. That's all we basically do in this sector, but we can do other districts as well. But for now, this is we found a niche for agro-industrial and forestry projects that need the extra layer of rule of law or stability, political and risk stability, that allows for investors to take the step forward and start their project. There's many projects in the agricultural sector in Honduras that don't get going because they are afraid or worried about land squatters or wrong land titles, and other issues of weak rule of law, weak institutions that don't allow for higher projects that are in higher technology or higher investment to get started. So in this case, what we as Orchid Properties, which is a ZEDE developer and administrator, we're a private Delaware corporation, and what we do is we help to look for other projects who need these layers of security and accompany them in creating the framework where their investors feel comfortable. That can include banks, feel comfortable to allow for the investment to happen and open their doors to the production cycle that they've decided to venture in. So we don't own land. We partner with entities and we accompany them with the regulatory framework to allow for these projects to happen.
Right. So thinking from the perspective of an investor, why would he or she choose a ZEDE instead of a free zone, like you said, as there are many across Central America? What is the main
opportunity? There's several. In practice, the Honduran government does not give authorization for free zones that are in the ag sector.
Right.
They authorize mainly, so agro-industrial parks are not authorized as free zones. So most of the sector acts, or it's really hard and it takes years to get your authorization, as it has happened to some of the shrimp farms and some of the fruit export companies, the newer ones that, like, for example, the cantaloupe and melon exporters, which now are as a product that goes around the world from Honduras. It takes years to get these authorizations. In this case, with the project that we have right now with the company AgroAlfa, it'll be the largest greenhouse project for vegetables, horticulture, exports in Central America will be 160 hectares of greenhouses with controlled irrigation. One of the reasons why someone would go for the ZEDE law is because of the quick process to get started once you have the land, or once you can prove initial investment. But also that there's other areas in which the Honduran government usually gets stuck on with industry, allowing industry within the free zone. So Honduras does not have healthcare and health producing free zone opportunities. It took about 20 years to allow for the service sector to enter free zones, and that was the first case was the business park, which is mainly a call center BPO operation. So you can have that, but you still did not have software development industry. You don't have a lot of other professional industries. But in particular, what we saw is that there's so much land in Honduras that is of suboptimal use, that there's a lot of projects that once you clear certain hurdles, certain stability hurdles, or certain political risk hurdles, then that allows for investment to come into agricultural areas that has a huge impact in areas that usually have people leaving and send remittances years later. But they go to the cities or they leave the country. So we can bring the economic impact to areas that with much needed opportunities. We have seen, and in some of the interviews that we do with employees in ZEDE Orquídea, is their income has doubled immediately from all of the last options that they had in the area around where they live at. Doubled, we have some tripled, and others even more because work was occasional. So now we've offered a stable opportunity, which that economic growth is immediately pouring into the town where we're closest to. And now income, not only family income is going up, but the cost of employment is going up, which also says it's a clear improvement that conditions are better in the town and in the rural area around where we are developing the project.
I see. Interesting. And what about the ZEDE as a product unto itself? How easy it is for a foreigner just to go to Honduras, buy a plot of land, set up their own rules, and start inviting companies in? What are the sort of requirements? Yeah,
I would say that it's not easy. I would say that if, as a foreigner, you think that you can apply any rules that you want and all flexibilization as you would like, I say that you first need to prove to your neighbors, to your municipality where you're operating, that what you're doing is good. If you start with unrealistic ideas, you lose, or you just never built the trust. You have to have the mentality of a good neighbor, because you will be surrounded by other people. In our case, we're not on coastal land. We don't see Honduras as a problem. We see Honduras as where we are. So you have to connect with the local economy. If you think you're going to have an economic island, then I recommend you don't look at ZEDEs and you don't look at coming to invest here, because you will run into social problems all across. You will not be able to tie in with the international systems that you need to be a part of for your economy to grow. That includes the international banking system, international customs systems. You will be followed by human rights organizations. So you have to be smart about these type of projects and not just say, oh, we can do any rules that we would like.
Yeah, it sounds like these adventures just some libertarian folks try to set up in many countries, in Chile, in Argentina, and they run into many kinds of problems because they were not aware of the complex reality of Latin America in general, where the cultural
anywhere. Those type of projects have failed everywhere when you don't take into consideration that you're doing it around someone else. And that there are certain international rules, especially since World War II, where you had United Nations and then the World Trade Organization, the World Customs Organization, and international human rights courts, and all of this stuff that comes with the package. International energy administrations, that you have to comply through international standards, and there are certain rules which you might question, but what you should do is try to improve them as much as possible within the system, which is what allows us, because what international treaties that most countries in the world have signed, the treaties set standards. They don't tell you how to do things, and the standards aren't necessarily bad. What usually is the problem, the bureaucratic problem, is on how to reach the standard. When they say you get to fill out 40 paperwork or hire certain amount, certain people or authorized personnel in order to do these processes, and when you create that bureaucracy, that's the problem that we usually don't like, and that's the problem that hinders economic development once you've understood the rules that you're under. But if you have to understand then that there is an international system, and you have to work within that international system. Otherwise, you will run into many more problems than you're asking for. And it's better, as I told you earlier, to figure out how you fit in this international order, and then start building up, and then modernize, and then invent, and then do all of these opportunities that the regulation allows. But don't think that you're going to act as if you're in a different planet.
So in this sense, have you seen interest more from US, Canadian, or European investors, or also from Latin American residents, maybe from Panama, Costa Rica? I don't know. What is the interest that
investment? I think investment here is more. Initially, it was somewhat ideological investment. And some adventurous investments, such as the tech industry, which has excess funds to invest in adventurous projects. Right. And that we've seen that in many, from space to ZEDEs, from all across. But now that the ZEDEs are real and that people can go visit, now we're seeing interest, which I consider to be the best interest is Honduran interest, is local landowners, local investors, and in our case, we have a local bank also involved in our project. So by having local or people that already know how to run businesses in Honduras, that know how to employ people in Honduras, that know how to comply with the Honduran system, if you now allow for these new regulations to also come up, then it's those people who have an advantage and that can go out to bring other investors into their projects. I would say, like if you were to do a forestry project or another agro production project, if you know the system, or at least know how to involve stakeholders around you, then you can also prove to international and institutional investors that your project, or how to implement a project of the industry that you're doing, and that their investment is safe because of the regulatory framework which you are now providing. So I wouldn't say it's coming in from any country in specific. It's from people that are looking at opportunities, and I would say that there is certain interest that has been there for a good while, which has been people that already work within the free zone industry. So that industry is always looking for new markets or new regulatory frameworks that allow for their manufacturing or remanufacturing or value-added operations to exist. So that's one of the big industries that we have seen of interest in this area.
Sure. And of course, this is all very new and hard to predict, but where do you see the ZEDEs experiment heading to? And what kinds of innovations do you think the ZEDEs will promote and maybe be copied in Honduras and abroad? What do you think is going to happen in that sense?
Well, I would say that it's initially, if more projects come in that are very conscious of their surroundings, then I think that we have a good outlook with ZEDEs. If projects come that want to be independent islands, that's not going to be good. But in timeline, first of all, is we have these general elections in November. So also it depends on most if not all main opposition parties have spoken against ZEDEs and saying that they would repeal them if they come to power. The repealing process is not a simple one. So it's not just a lot of it is plain politics. But if the current administration or current party stays in power, then obviously we see stability there. If there's a change in power, we're going to see, it depends on how Congress is structured, because you need two legislations to change the law and a referendum for on the residents. So if there's residents in ZEDEs, you have to do a referendum first, and then do a legislative change in two legislations. So that would mean that the earliest, if everything went bad for ZEDEs and an opposition party that is keen on taking out the ZEDEs in particular, it doesn't matter what ideology, I'm just talking about taking out the ZEDEs for whatever reason they believe in, they would need to have 2/3 vote in Congress. They would need to vote in two different legislations. So that would mean that the first vote would happen somewhere around February 2022, and the next vote would have to happen around February 2023. So that gives us 2 good years. Basically we've had a 2-year horizon in which we know the legislation is there. And if the legislation changes, there is at least a 10-year period in which whatever is changed does not affect the projects that have already started. This is an investment protection clause that is common in CAFTA, for example, in the Central American Free Trade Agreement. It's common in many free trade agreements in which rules that say that once things change or if something has changed, it doesn't apply for a certain period back. So I think there's more stability than what some of the political opposition says regarding ZEDEs, but we have to be understanding of the surrounding and the reality that we're doing. That's going to say a lot about what we do and the future of the ZEDE project in the country.
Of course, yeah, and we have also seen some news reports about local opposition to some ZEDEs. And are these opposition movements ideological, or are they more to do with the fact that the ruling party has spearheaded the ZEDE amendment process?
It's all of those. Some are ideological, some are I'll say everyone against it is definitely against it because of the official party, because it's been in power for 3 periods, which is the longest that a party has been in power consecutively since the 1982 Constitution came into effect. So there's obviously political push to try to change the administration. But then you have also a lot of people who are against this economic development model, who feel that it creates elites or special interest or favored groups, because it allows for the end of some unnecessary bureaucratic processes that it doesn't allow them to have. We have always thought that this legislation is to prove concepts, not to create islands, and that those good concepts should spread to the rest of the country. The wish is, those of us that were in Congress when these things were the legislation was passed, our idea was that these good rules work as osmosis into the rest of the economy, into the rest of the country, and with that, the rest of Honduras learns and improves. That was the purpose of it. This is an economic development model, not to create economic elites. So then besides those opposition groups, then you have all of the confused people, which don't really know why they're against it, but they know they're against the party, or they're against a model, or ideologically inclined in a certain other way, but in general confused. And when we measure public opinion, usually it's somewhere between 50 and 60% of people that are asked during these polling, they have no opinion on ZEDEs. So it's a certain sector of the economy of the country that has it, but there's a large population that does not clearly have an idea why they would be against.
I see. Well, these are very exciting times, and we'll keep following the ZEDEs evolution for the years to come, because as you said, it has at least some 10 years down the road. So Guillermo, if you want to leave us with a final thought on not only ZEDEs, Honduras, or even trends in the world you are seeing that is going to shape the way we do business around this region.
I think there's. I would like to take the opportunity to say that there is a huge opportunity in the energy sector, as Honduras stayed far behind Guatemala and El Salvador as they reformed in the mid '90s. Honduras had not reformed and opened its energy sector. So now, after a couple of years of fighting the system, and now that many of the rules needed for private investment are in place, now we can call in for investment in transmission and substations and distribution sectors. There's a higher security now for the payment and generation, in power generation. And the legislation also allows for new ways of, or new energy mechanisms to come into the country that before would be of too high of a risk. For example, natural gas, that there was no natural gas investment in the country. So within the energy sector, there's a lot of infrastructure parts and market elements that are now possible, such as also the liberation, say the private sector, that a good now over 300 companies are above the threshold to do private to private contracts in the energy sector, just like it can happen in Guatemala, like it happens in Colombia, like it happens in certain parts of the States, like it happens in Chile and in Peru. So that would be the models, the energy models that we're following. And I would say that's a really important area, because it's a strategic area for the economy. If we do not have stable and accessible power, then we cannot develop more complex economies. So it sounds basic, but there's a huge opportunity there for anyone interested.
Definitely, and we will also include it in our radar, so we'll keep all our listeners posted on the developments. Guillermo, thank you so much for coming on the show. You can follow Guillermo. He's on Twitter, LinkedIn, maybe some other social media. And we'll put all the link in the show notes. You can check it out at ecanamericas.com/podcast. Please follow us on all the major social media platforms we are on, and leave us your comments, your suggestions, which topics we should cover. We're all ears. So thank you once again, and see you next month.